Modern pomologists are completely stunned by fruit cultivars that outperform today's most advanced hybrids. Apple varieties so resilient and flavorful they could revolutionize orchards across America for generations to come. These extraordinary trees were carefully cultivated over centuries, then mysteriously vanished from our food system until one farmer followed a tattered map to their secret location. Before we reveal the forgotten apple varieties that have multi-billion-dollar agricultural corporations rushing to secure rights to their genetics, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we're sharing another incredible historical discovery that will completely change how you think about the food that once graced our ancestors' tables. The Harrington Heritage Orchard stood as a living testament to pomological resilience in the secluded valleys of Vermont's Green Mountains. While neighboring farms had converted to commercial monocultures with their uniform rows and chemical-dependent operations, the 75-acre property remained proudly independent. At its heart sat a modest farmhouse built in 1842, its sturdy foundation and weathered clapboards having sheltered 4 generations who'd weathered blights, economic upheavals, and the relentless standardization of American agriculture. The orchard itself seemed to defy modern fruit-growing logic. Instead of regimented rows of identical trees that characterized commercial operations, the Harrington land featured a diverse collection of apple varieties arranged in patterns that appeared almost random to the untrained eye. Trees of different ages, heights, and structures created a landscape more reminiscent of an edible forest than a conventional orchard. Scattered among the apple trees were companion plantings of herbs, berries, and flowers that created complex symbiotic relationships modern agriculture had largely abandoned. On a crisp autumn morning, the orchard revealed its true character. The rising sun illuminated a tapestry of colors rarely seen in commercial operations. Deep crimson fruits nestled alongside golden yellows, speckled russets, and vibrant greens. The trees themselves varied dramatically in form, from the upright columnar varieties that dominated the northeastern section to the gracefully spreading branches of ancient trees in the southwest corner that had been producing fruit for over a century. Even the bark patterns told stories of diversity, smooth and silver on some, deeply furrowed and rugged on others. A visitor walking the winding paths between these trees would notice something remarkable about the soundscape as, well, unlike the relative silence of conventional orchards, the Harrington property hummed with biodiversity. Bees navigating between specialized pollinator plants, birds chattering as they hunted for insects among the branches, and the rustling of beneficial ground cover that hosted predatory insects keeping harmful pests in check. This symphony of natural interactions created a self-regulating ecosystem that required remarkably little human intervention. Most remarkable was how the Harrington trees flourished without the intensive spray regimens considered essential in modern apple production. While commercial orchards typically required 15 to 20 chemical applications annually to produce marketable fruit, these heritage trees yielded abundant harvests with minimal intervention. Visiting agricultural extension officers had repeatedly documented the orchard's unusual resistance to common diseases and pests, particularly during seasons when other regional orchards suffered devastating losses. It doesn't make sense, according to conventional pomology, admitted Dr. Elaine Richardson from the State Agricultural Extension during her 3rd visit that season. These trees shouldn't be this healthy without the standard chemical protocols. Yet here they are, producing exceptional fruit with minimal disease pressure even during challenging seasons. The farm's approach to propagation told a similar story of integration between traditional wisdom and selective modern techniques. In the grafting shed behind the main house, ancient tools for budding and grafting shared space with more contemporary Equipment. The walls displayed hand-drawn diagrams showing precise cutting techniques that had been refined through generations of trial and error. Wooden cabinets contained carefully labeled containers of grafting wax made according to family. Recipes that varied depending on seasonal conditions and the specific varieties being joined. Fourth-generation owner Thomas Harrington had maintained detailed records of each tree's lineage, carefully preserving varieties that had disappeared from commercial cultivation generations ago. Unlike the handful of standardized varieties dominating supermarket shelves, the Harrington Orchard preserved over 60 distinct apple types, each with unique characteristics for eating, cooking, cider making, or storage. These weren't just curiosities. Each variety served specific purposes within the farm's integrated approach. The Wixon crab, nearly extinct in commercial cultivation, provided crucial early-season pollination for later varieties while producing intensely flavored fruit for specialty ciders. The blue pearmain, with its distinctive bloom on deep purple-blue skin, offered exceptional storage capabilities, remaining crisp in the root cellar until the following spring, when other apples had long since softened. The Roxbury russet, America's oldest cultivated variety, produced fruit with exceptional disease resistance and complex flavors that developed over months in storage. What made the Harrington approach particularly noteworthy was its resilience during increasingly extreme climate events. During the devastating late spring freeze of 2023 that decimated blooms across New England, their diverse collection had yielded a partial harvest, while neighboring orchards lost entire crops. Some varieties bloomed earlier, others later, creating a sequential flowering period that ensured at least some would avoid the killing frost. When unpredictable temperature fluctuations confused pollinator patterns in 2021, their integrated habitat supported sufficient wild pollinator populations to ensure adequate fruit set. Regional pomologists had studied these outcomes for years, but the family remained protective of certain methods, sharing only vague references to grandmother's approach or the old wisdom. Their reluctance wasn't merely traditionalism, but stemmed from earlier experiences where outside experts had dismissed their methods, only to later appropriate elements without understanding the integrated whole. Throughout the farmhouse, evidence of this multi-generational knowledge transfer appeared in handwritten notebooks, carefully preserved seed collections, and meticulously labeled maps tracking the orchard's evolution over decades. Family photographs spanning a century showed the gradual transformation of the landscape according to principles that seemed to anticipate modern challenges. Even the placement of beehives, windbreaks, and water management systems followed patterns that had proven remarkably prescient about increasingly erratic weather patterns and pollinator decline. The family's current steward, Jack Harrington, hadn't planned on becoming the guardian of this pomological legacy. At 38, the former botany researcher had spent 8 years at the University of Vermont's Plant Resilience Institute, before returning home when his father's Parkinson's diagnosis made managing the demanding work of maintaining their traditional orchard increasingly difficult. His research had focused on plant adaptation to climate stress, work that had taken him to research stations across the country, documenting how different varieties responded to changing conditions. Jack's scientific training had initially made him skeptical of family methods that appeared to contradict modern horticultural science. The seemingly random placement of companion plants, the refusal to implement standard spray protocols, and the maintenance of trees long past their commercially productive age had struck him as inefficient sentimentality during his early academic career. Yet the orchard's undeniable success challenged his academic assumptions, creating a cognitive dissonance that eventually sparked his research focus. After his father's passing 3 years ago, Jack found himself the sole inheritor of both the physical property and the responsibility of preserving methods that had kept the orchard productive for over a century. The transition wasn't merely professional, but philosophical, requiring him to integrate his scientific understanding with generations of observed wisdom that had never been validated through conventional research methods, yet consistently produced results that defied explanation. "I spent years studying controlled experiments with isolated variables," Jack explained to a group of visiting agricultural students. "Here, I'm learning to see interactions as my ancestors did, not as isolated relationships, but as an integrated whole. The science validates elements of what we do, but it still struggles to explain how these elements work together in patterns my great-grandmother could recognize intuitively." The property tax notice on Jack Harrington's kitchen table represented far more than a bureaucratic formality. It embodied the mounting pressures threatening the orchard's survival. This year's assessment had increased by 37% following the county's revaluation, reflecting skyrocketing land values as wealthy urbanites sought authentic rural retreats within weekend driving distance of Boston. The new figure would add nearly $7,400 to the orchard's annual expenses, an amount that would have been challenging even during a good production year. Unfortunately, this hadn't been a good year. An unusually warm February had triggered early bud development, followed by a devastating April freeze that damaged approximately 40% of the orchard's potential harvest. While the Harringtons' diverse varieties and microclimate management had fared better than neighboring commercial operations, some of which lost entire crops, the financial impact remained significant. The reduced harvest meant less income from direct sales, fewer specialty apples for their premium cider operation, and diminished reserves for the coming winter. Jack sipped his morning coffee while reviewing the latest quarterly financial statements he'd prepared. As someone who had once navigated research grant budgets, he brought analytical rigor to the orchard's financial management. The spreadsheet on his laptop displayed concerning trends, rising input costs for even the minimal organic treatments they used, increasing fuel prices affecting delivery expenses, and insurance premiums that climbed annually despite their perfect claim history. Meanwhile, large-scale commercial operations continued flooding the market with artificially cheap apples, keeping consumer price expectations unrealistically low. "Your grandfather never worried about spreadsheets," observed Eleanor Harrington, Jack's 83-year-old grandmother, who still maintained the extensive herb garden that provided many of the orchard's companion plantings. She moved with surprising agility between kitchen tasks as she prepared breakfast, her hands showing the characteristic weathering of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. "He knew the trees would provide if we listened properly." Jack smiled at her familiar refrain. "The trees are doing their part, Gran. It's the county assessor and insurance companies that aren't listening." He didn't mention the additional financial pressure weighing on him. His father's medical bills had depleted most of the family's savings during his final years. The specialized care required for Parkinson's patients had quickly overwhelmed their modest health insurance coverage, leaving debts that still remained 3 years after his passing. The financial challenges weren't the only pressures converging on the Harrington orchard. Jack's email inbox contained 3 separate messages from Orchard Tech Enterprises, a rapidly expanding agribusiness that had been acquiring family farms throughout New England to convert them to high-density, technology-driven apple production. Their latest offer had reached $2.4 million for the property, a figure deliberately calculated to seem irresistible to a family facing mounting financial challenges. "We understand your attachment to traditional methods," their representative had written in silky corporate language, "which is why our Heritage Partners program would allow you to maintain a small demonstration orchard on the property while we implement our precision agriculture systems on the majority of the acreage." This partnership preserves your family legacy while providing financial security and bringing 21st century efficiency to land that's currently underutilized. The language about underutilization particularly grated on Jack. The corporation measured productivity solely by yield per acre, ignoring the ecological services, biodiversity benefits, and climate resilience the Harrington approach provided. Their precision agriculture model would replace the orchard's integrated ecosystem with densely packed dwarf trees, requiring trellising, drip irrigation, and intensified chemical regimens, essentially transforming a living landscape into an outdoor factory. The irony wasn't lost on Jack. Orchard Tech coveted their property precisely because a century of Harrington stewardship had built exceptional soil health, beneficial insect populations, and balanced ecology. Yet their management would rapidly deplete these resources, extracting short-term profits while degrading the very qualities that had made the land valuable. He had witnessed this pattern repeatedly during his research career as investors acquired exemplary farms only to undermine their long-term viability through extractive practices. They called again yesterday, Eleanor noted, placing a plate of eggs and homemade sourdough toast before him. The eggs came from the heritage breed chickens that roamed specific sections of the orchard in mobile coops, providing pest management and fertilization while producing income through premium egg sales. That young man, with the two perfect teeth, offered to take me to lunch in Burlington to discuss transition options. Jack laughed, despite his concerns. His grandmother's assessment of corporate representatives was invariably accurate and unfiltered. What did you tell him? That I had better things to do than listen to city nonsense, and the only transition this orchard needs is from one Harrington generation to the next. Her expression softened. But Jack, I understand the pressures you're facing. Your father and grandfather never had to deal with taxes and costs like these. The world's changed around us. Eleanor's acknowledgement of the challenges hung in the air between them, a rare concession from someone who typically dismissed modern complications with fierce pragmatism. Her words underscored the reality Jack confronted daily. The Harrington approach had sustained the family for generations, but economic and regulatory systems increasingly favored industrialized models that externalized their true costs. The pressure intensified later that morning when Jack visited Montclair Orchard Supply to purchase specialized grafting supplies. The store had been the region's primary source for orchard equipment for 3 generations. Its knowledgeable staff and selective inventory valued by serious fruit growers throughout the state. "Did you hear about the Wheelers?" asked Michael. Denton, the store's owner, as he packaged Jack's grafting tape. "Signed the papers with Orchard Tech last week. 5th-generation apple family gone just like that." He shook his head, the disappointment evident in his voice. "They're already bringing in the bulldozers to clear the old trees, putting in high-density plantings on the whole 120 acres. The news hit Jack hard. The Wheeler Orchard had been one of the few remaining operations with a similar philosophy to the Harringtons. David Wheeler had often exchanged scion wood with Jack's father, maintaining some of the same heritage varieties through decades of mutual support. Their capitulation to corporate acquisition represented more than the loss of another independent orchard. It meant the disappearance of trees carrying generations of genetic adaptation to local conditions. David said they just couldn't make the numbers work anymore. Michael continued, ringing up the purchase. Between the hail damage last year and his daughter deciding against coming back to the farm after college, he didn't see a path forward. Orchard Tech offered debt forgiveness and a consulting contract, hard to turn down when you're staring at bankruptcy. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine Chen, the regional representative for VitaTech Agricultural Systems. Her polished appearance and tablet computer stood in stark contrast to the practical workclothes and calloused hands of the farmers examining equipment around the store. She smiled with professional warmth when she spotted Jack. "Dr. Harrington, I was hoping to run into you. I've been meaning to follow up on our proposal for transitioning portions of your orchard to our smart farming system. The partial implementation model would allow you to maintain traditional methods on select acreage while benefiting from our technology on the remainder. The cost-sharing program I mentioned could offset most of the initial investment." Before Jack could respond, his phone chimed with an alert from the local weather service, a specialized notification system for orchardists predicting potential frost events. The forecast showed concerning temperature patterns developing for the coming weekend, when many of his early varieties would be at their most vulnerable stage of development. Such precise advance warnings were valuable, but they also created new stress as growers became increasingly aware of threats they could do little to mitigate. The morning's interactions highlighted the converging pressures on the Harrington Orchard. Economic challenges, corporate acquisition efforts, technological displacement, climate volatility, and the steady disappearance of similar operations that had once formed a community of mutual support. Each pressure alone would have been manageable, but together they created a perfect storm, threatening the continuation of their approach. Driving back to the orchard, Jack passed 3 properties that had transitioned from diversified family farms to large-scale operations within the past decade. The landscape transformation was striking. Hedgerows removed to maximize plantable acreage, wetlands drained, and complex field patterns replaced with uniform plantings optimized for mechanical harvesting. Each conversion represented not just changing ownership, but the erasure of agricultural knowledge embedded in particular relationships with specific landscapes. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on Jack. His scientific training had prepared him to validate elements of his family's approach using contemporary research methods. He had published peer-reviewed papers on the microbial diversity in their orchard soil and presented at conferences about their integrated pest management system. Yet this academic validation did little to address the economic and regulatory systems that systematically disadvantaged their holistic approach, systems that couldn't measure or value the full spectrum of benefits their methods provided. He turned onto the gravel drive leading to the farmhouse. Jack noticed a sleek black SUV parked beside his grandmother's aging Subaru. The vehicle's pristine condition and rental company logo suggested another corporate visitor, likely the persistent orchard tech representative Eleanor had mentioned. The timing couldn't have been worse, with frost mitigation preparations needed before nightfall and grafting work scheduled for the following morning. Jack parked beside the vehicle, steeling himself for another carefully scripted conversation about unlocking your property's potential or transitioning to sustainable intensification. These corporate representatives were increasingly well-versed in appropriating the language of sustainability while promoting practices that undermined its fundamental principles. Their proposals invariably focused on extracting marketable elements from the Harrington approach while discarding the integrated system that made those elements effective. As he approached the farmhouse, he saw Eleanor on the porch with not one visitor but 3, each in the business casual attire that marked them as corporate representatives rather than working orchardists. Their polished appearance contrasted sharply with Eleanor's gardening clothes and the weathered authenticity of the farmhouse setting. Through the screen door, he could hear fragments of conversation about heritage branding opportunities and premium market positioning. The scene crystallized something Jack had been feeling increasingly over recent months. The Harrington Orchard existed at a crossroads between fundamentally different approaches to agriculture and land stewardship. The mounting pressures weren't simply financial challenges to overcome, but existential questions about what would be preserved and what would be lost as agricultural systems continued their rapid transformation. The stakes extended beyond their family legacy to include disappearing knowledge that might prove crucial for food systems facing climate disruption and ecological decline. The discovery that would change everything came during preparations for the threatened frost. After politely but firmly ushering the corporate representatives off the property, Jack and Eleanor began implementing the orchard's frost protection protocols, methods refined through generations of response to spring temperature fluctuations. These preparations required retrieving specialized equipment from the farm's oldest structure, a stone root cellar built into the hillside behind the house. "We need the old copper sprayers," Eleanor directed, as they descended the worn stone steps into the cool darkness of the cellar. "Your grandfather always said they distributed the protective mixture more evenly than modern equipment. They should be on the back shelves with the other frost supplies." The root cellar dated to the original homestead establishment in 1842, its thick stone walls and earth insulation maintaining consistent temperatures year-round. The Harringtons had used it continuously for specialized apple storage, preserving certain varieties that improved with age under precise humidity conditions. The space also served as secure storage for the orchard's most valuable tools and records, protected from temperature fluctuations and potential fire damage that might affect the main house. Jack navigated through narrow aisles created by wooden shelving units filled with carefully labeled equipment, supplies, and storage containers. The back section, dedicated to specialized seasonal tools, had been reorganized following his father's death. In the dim light provided by the single bulb hanging from the ceiling, Jack noticed a small door in the rear wall he hadn't paid attention to before, likely a secondary storage nook typical of these old root cellars. "I don't see the copper sprayers back here, Gran," he called. "Do you remember where Dad might have moved them during his reorganization?" Eleanor made her way through the narrow passage, her familiarity with the space evident in her confident movements despite the low light. "Thomas always kept them in the back cabinet, the one built into the wall. It might be stuck. The humidity makes the wood swell sometimes." Jack identified the cabinet door she mentioned, noticing it was indeed swollen against its frame. With firm pressure, he managed to open it, revealing not the expected equipment, but a space filled with documents, bound journals, folded papers, and what appeared to be maps in protective oilcloth wrappings. A small wooden box sat prominently in the center, its surface inscribed with an intricate apple tree design. "What's all this?" he asked, carefully removing the box. "I thought this cabinet was for the frost protection equipment." Eleanor moved closer, her expression shifting from practical focus to unexpected recognition. "I haven't seen that box in decades," she whispered, reaching toward it with surprising reverence. "Your grandfather showed it to me once, just after we were married. It was already an old family heirloom then." The box was crafted from a dense reddish wood that had aged to a deep patina, its surface carved with botanical details that revealed an artisan's intimate knowledge of apple trees, not just general representations, but anatomically accurate. Depictions of blossoms, fruit development, and branch structure. Small hinges of tarnished brass suggested it opened, though no obvious latch was visible. "There's a hidden mechanism," Eleanor explained, gently taking the box from Jack. Her fingers moved with the certainty of remembered knowledge, pressing specific points in the carved design. With a soft click, the lid released, revealing contents protected from time and elements. A folded parchment document, several small cloth pouches, and what appeared to be dried apple seeds, carefully separated into labeled compartments. "Your grandfather called it the Founder's Box," Eleanor explained, her voice taking on the quality she used for sharing family stories. "It was passed down from Isaiah Harrington, who established our orchard in 1842. The family tradition said it contained the heart of the orchard, though your grandfather never explained exactly what that meant." Jack carefully unfolded the parchment document, revealing a map drawn with remarkable precision and artistic skill. Unlike typical property surveys from the 1800s, this map featured extensive botanical notations, microclimate indicators, and detailed topographical elements. Most striking were precisely drawn apple trees, marked with symbols and notations in faded ink, some located on what was clearly the current Harrington property, but others scattered across a broader landscape extending into areas now owned by neighboring farms and the Green Mountain National Forest. "This isn't just a property map," Jack observed, his researcher's eye quickly recognizing the document's significance. "It's a detailed botanical survey showing specific apple tree locations, varieties, and apparently their various characteristics." He pointed to a legend in the corner containing symbols that corresponded to markings throughout the map. These notations track disease resistance, cold hardiness, storage quality, and flavor profiles. This is essentially a 19th century geographical database of apple genetics. Eleanor leaned closer, adjusting her glasses to examine the details. "The stories said Isaiah was meticulous about documenting everything. Your grandfather mentioned he'd been trained in botany at Harvard before establishing the orchard, but I always thought that was family mythology rather than historical fact." As Jack studied the map more carefully, he noticed something curious. The most detailed documentation and most extensive notations focused on an area approximately 3 miles from the current orchard boundaries, in what was now part of the National Forest. This section, marked with an elaborate compass rose and labeled "The Mother Trees," contained detailed drawings of 7 apple trees with extensive notes about their characteristics and apparent significance. "Gran, do you know anything about the mother trees?" he asked, pointing to the notation on the map. "It looks like Isaiah considered these specimens particularly important." Eleanor shook her head. "I've never heard that specific term. Your grandfather occasionally mentioned the old trees on the mountain, but never explained what he meant. I assumed he was referring to wild apples." Jack carefully refolded the map and continued examining the box's contents. The small pouches contained what appeared to be very old grafting tools of unusual design, specialized knives with curved blades, unlike any he had seen in modern catalogs or antique collections. The seed compartments were meticulously labeled with variety names he didn't recognize: Frost Guardian, Summer Keeper, Healer's Sweet, Crimson Heart, Winter Justice, Orchard's Pride, and Founder's Gift. "These varieties don't appear in any pomological records I've studied," Jack noted, his excitement growing as he recognized the potential significance. "And some of these characteristics described on the map would be extraordinary, even by modern standards. Disease resistance without spray programs, extreme cold hardiness, natural pest deterrence, extended storage capability without controlled atmosphere technology." As he continued examining the documents, Jack discovered a slim, leather-bound journal tucked beneath the map. The journal, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting and detailed botanical illustrations, appeared to be Isaiah Harrington's personal record of his apple breeding program. Unlike the practical growing notes maintained by subsequent generations, this document presented a sophisticated scientific approach to apple genetics that seemed remarkably advanced for its era. "Listen to this," Jack said, carefully turning pages of the fragile journal. "Having observed the rapid decline in apple diversity as commercial considerations increasingly favor appearance over resilience, I am committed to preserving varieties that maintain natural resistance to disease and environmental stress. The 7 mother trees I have identified represent exceptional specimens with qualities that must be preserved for future generations, facing challenges we can only begin to anticipate." Eleanor sat on an old wooden stool, her expression thoughtful. "It sounds like Isaiah was already concerned about the loss of apple diversity back in the 1800s. Some things haven't changed much, have they? Jack nodded, continuing to read passages from the journal. The mother trees represent my finest selections. After examining over 3,000 wild and cultivated specimens throughout New England, each demonstrates exceptional qualities that commercial orchards are rapidly abandoning in favor of cosmetic uniformity. I have established this sanctuary orchard to preserve these genetics and continue developing varieties adapted to coming challenges. The most intriguing entry came near the journal's end. I have determined that the original mother trees must be maintained in their natural setting, away from the cultivated orchard, to ensure their continued adaptation and resilience. The remote location I have selected offers protection from the agricultural fashions and diseases that threaten cultivated specimens. These trees shall remain my closely held secret, known only to future Harringtons who demonstrate true commitment to pomological diversity. Jack looked up from the journal, meeting his grandmother's eyes with growing excitement. Isaiah wasn't just documenting existing varieties. He identified exceptional specimens with unique genetic qualities and deliberately preserved them in a remote location. According to these coordinates, that location still exists within what's now the National Forest. The implications of their discovery expanded with each document they examined. Additional journal entries revealed that Isaiah had indeed received formal botanical training at Harvard, studying under renowned professors during the early 19th century. He had apparently established the Harrington Orchard specifically to preserve and develop apple varieties with exceptional adaptive qualities, recognizing even then the vulnerability of agricultural systems that prioritize standardization over resilience. Most remarkably, Isaiah had documented specific breeding goals that aligned perfectly with challenges facing modern orchardists, developing varieties with natural resistance to fungal diseases, creating apples that could withstand temperature fluctuations without crop loss, and preserving flavor complexity that industrial production was already sacrificing for shipping durability and visual uniformity. He was breeding apples to address problems that wouldn't become widely recognized for another century, Jack observed with growing amazement. This isn't just historically interesting. These mother trees, if they still exist, could contain genetic resources that modern breeding programs have been trying to develop for decades. As they carefully gathered the materials and returned to the farmhouse, the full significance of their discovery began to crystallize. If Isaiah's documented mother trees had survived in their remote location, they would represent nearly 2 centuries of continuous adaptation to changing climate conditions, disease pressures, and environmental stresses without human intervention or chemical protections. Such specimens could potentially contain genetic traits of immense value for developing climate-resilient apple varieties adapted to the increasingly volatile conditions facing modern agriculture. "We need to find these trees," Jack said as they spread the map across the kitchen table, using modern topographical maps to identify the current location indicated by Isaiah's coordinates. According to this, they should be in a remote section of the National Forest, about 3 miles from our eastern boundary. The area is fairly inaccessible now, probably why they've remained undisturbed if they've survived. Eleanor studied both maps carefully. The old logging road that runs along Beaver Creek might get you within a mile. After that, it would be cross-country hiking through pretty rough terrain. Despite her age, she remained remarkably familiar with the surrounding wilderness from decades of foraging for medicinal plants and wild foods. As evening approached, Jack found himself unable to focus on the scheduled frost preparations, his mind continuously returning to the potential significance of Isaiah's mother trees. If they had survived, they would represent far more than historical curiosities. They could contain genetic resources directly relevant to the challenges facing modern orchards. The timing seemed almost providential, as if Isaiah had somehow anticipated both the agricultural vulnerabilities of the 21st century and the precise moment when his descendants would most need alternative approaches. Your grandfather always said the orchard would provide what we needed when we needed it most, Eleanor observed, noting Jack's distraction as they finished securing frost protection measures. Perhaps finding this map now, when the orchard faces its greatest threats, isn't coincidence. Jack nodded, recognizing the convergence of circumstances that made their discovery particularly significant. The mounting pressures from commercial agriculture, climate disruption, and economic challenges had created a critical juncture for the Harrington approach. Isaiah's mother trees, if they still existed, might offer not just historical connection, but practical resources for navigating these contemporary challenges. That night, after confirming all frost protection measures were in place, Jack returned to studying Isaiah's journal by lamplight. Beyond the specific details about apple varieties and breeding techniques, the document revealed a sophisticated ecological understanding that anticipated modern concepts of biodiversity, genetic preservation, and climate adaptation. Isaiah hadn't been merely a farmer preserving favorite varieties. He had been a scientific visionary documenting approaches that mainstream agriculture wouldn't recognize as valuable for another century and a half. As he carefully turned the journal's fragile pages, Jack realized they had discovered far more than an interesting historical document or potential genetic resource. They had found evidence of an alternative agricultural knowledge system, one developed through careful observation and multi-generational relationship with specific landscapes, rather than abstract scientific principles or market considerations. This approach had anticipated challenges that contemporary agriculture was only beginning to address, offering potential solutions from an unexpected source. The carefully preserved wisdom of a 19th-century pomologist who had recognized vulnerabilities his contemporaries ignored. Dawn broke clear and cold, the threatened frost having materialized overnight despite their protective measures. Jack had risen before first light to check the orchard, finding the specialized sprays and wind machines had successfully prevented damage to the vulnerable blossoms. The morning inspection complete, he returned to the farmhouse to prepare for the expedition that had occupied his thoughts throughout the restless night. The forecast shows clear weather through tomorrow, Jack noted, spreading topographical maps across the kitchen table where Eleanor was preparing provisions for his journey. If I start within the hour, I should have most of the day to locate the site marked on Isaiah's map. Eleanor nodded, her practical nature evident in the carefully packed provisions she'd assembled: dried apple slices from last season's harvest, homemade jerky, sourdough bread, and thermoses of hot tea infused with herbs from her garden. You'll want the GPS for general navigation, but remember what your grandfather always said about technology in the mountains. Jack smiled, completing the familiar family adage. Trust the land first, then the map, then the compass, and technology last. Of all, the saying reflected the Harrington approach to landscape navigation, recognizing that relationships with specific places provided more reliable guidance than abstract technological systems. His backpack already contained Isaiah's map in a protective case, a high-quality compass, and modern topographical maps alongside the GPS device, layers of navigational tools appropriate to the challenging terrain. I've marked the key reference points from Isaiah's map onto the modern topographical survey, Jack explained, indicating where he'd identified landmarks that had remained consistent over the centuries: distinctive rock formations, stream confluences, and unique topographical features. If his measurements were accurate, the mother trees should be located in this small valley on the northeastern slope, about 2,100 feet in elevation. Eleanor studied the location, her brow furrowing slightly. That's deep in the national forest. Now well off any maintained trails, the old logging road ends several miles from there. Her concern wasn't just for Jack's safety, but reflected the practical challenges of accessing such remote terrain. The undergrowth will be dense this time of year. Jack had anticipated these challenges, packing appropriate gear for backcountry, navigation, sturdy hiking boots, lightweight pruning shears for clearing path when necessary, and extra layers to accommodate the temperature variations common in mountain terrain. His background in field research had prepared him for extensive wilderness work, though the emotional significance of this particular expedition added an element of pressure beyond typical scientific exploration. "I've scheduled the whole day for this," he assured Eleanor. "If I haven't located the site by mid-afternoon, I'll mark the progress and return later with more supplies for a multi-day search." But Isaiah's coordinates seem remarkably precise for 19th century mapping technology. Eleanor handed him a small cloth pouch, its weathered fabric suggesting considerable age. "Take this grafting knife. It was your grandfather's and his grandfather's before him. Thomas always said it had a way of finding the right branches. The tool, with its worn wooden handle and meticulously maintained steel blade, represented generations of orchard knowledge embodied in a practical implement. By 7:30, Jack had parked his truck at the end of the old logging road, the weathered gate marking the boundary where vehicular access ended and wilderness began. The morning air carried the distinct scent of spring forest, the sharp tang of pine resin mixing with the earthy aroma of thawing soil and the subtle sweetness of early wildflowers. Birdsong punctuated the stillness as he shouldered his pack and examined the terrain ahead. The first mile followed a discernible though unmaintained trail, likely used by occasional hikers and wildlife. Jack maintained a steady pace, recognizing the need to conserve energy for the more challenging navigation ahead. His research training had taught him the methodical approach needed for wilderness fieldwork: consistent observation, regular map checks, and constant awareness of changing terrain features. As the trail gradually disappeared into increasingly dense undergrowth, Jack began the more intensive work of cross-country navigation. Isaiah's map indicated a route following a seasonal stream that should lead toward the valley containing the mother trees. Modern satellite imagery had confirmed the continued existence of this watershed, though forest succession over the past century had undoubtedly changed the surrounding vegetation significantly. 2 hours into the journey, having gained nearly 1,000 feet in elevation, Jack paused at a distinctive rock formation that appeared on both Isaiah's map and the modern topographical survey. The three-tiered stone outcropping, weather-worn into a shape reminiscent of stacked books, provided a crucial confirmation that he was on the correct route. According to Isaiah's notes, the mother trees lay approximately 1 mile northeast from this landmark, in a protected valley with a southeastern exposure. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as Jack left the established watershed. Spring undergrowth created a dense barrier of new vegetation that required careful navigation and occasional clearing with the pruning shears. The forest composition had shifted with elevation, transitioning from the mixed hardwoods of lower slopes to predominantly coniferous stands interspersed with hardy northern species adapted to the mountain's microclimate. By midday, perspiring from exertion despite the cool air, Jack reached another landmark indicated on Isaiah's map, a small seasonal waterfall that dropped approximately 15 feet over a granite ledge. The feature remained remarkably unchanged from Isaiah's detailed drawing, though the surrounding forest had evolved considerably. According to the map, this marked the entrance to the narrow valley that should contain the mother trees. Jack paused to rest and consult both maps, comparing Isaiah's hand-drawn landmarks with the modern topographical features. The precision of the 19th century measurements continued to impress him. Despite using relatively primitive instruments, Isaiah had created a remarkably accurate survey of this remote landscape. This accuracy seemed to confirm the methodical, scientific approach evident in his journal entries. The valley itself proved more difficult to access than anticipated. Forest succession over the past century had created a dense understory that obscured the entrance Isaiah had marked. Jack spent nearly an hour seeking the narrow passage indicated on the map, eventually identifying a game trail that appeared to follow the approximate route. The path, likely maintained by deer and other wildlife, provided a navigable, if circuitous, route into the protected basin. As he entered the valley, Jack noticed subtle changes in the forest composition. The vegetation here displayed greater diversity than surrounding areas, with unusual combinations of species not typically found growing together. Most notably, several understory plants commonly associated with apple cultivation appeared with surprising frequency: yarrow, comfrey, and specific mint varieties that the Harringtons traditionally planted as companion species in their orchard. Their presence in this remote location seemed unlikely to be coincidental. The afternoon light had developed the golden quality typical of mountain elevations when Jack reached coordinates that should, according to Isaiah's measurements, place him in the immediate vicinity of the mother trees. He stood in a small clearing surrounded by mature forest, surveying the landscape for any signs of ancient apple trees. Initial disappointment gave way to methodical observation as he reminded himself that nearly 2 centuries had passed since Isaiah established this remote orchard. The trees, if they survived, would not appear as conventional orchard specimens but would have integrated into the forest ecosystem. Moving in expanding concentric circles from the central coordinates, Jack carefully examined the forest composition. His trained eye began identifying subtle anomalies: forest trees with branch structures suggesting previous management, remnants of what might have been intentional plantings now obscured by natural succession, and most promisingly, several elder plants commonly used as indicators in traditional orchard systems. Nearly ready to postpone the search until the following day, Jack noticed an unusual pattern in the canopy structure, approximately 50 yards to the east. The afternoon light, striking at a particular angle, revealed a circular clearing not immediately obvious from ground level. The distinctive spacing suggested deliberate design rather than natural forest dynamics, exactly the pattern he would expect from a carefully established orchard site that had subsequently been integrated into surrounding forest succession. Heart racing with anticipation, Jack navigated toward the distinctive canopy pattern. As he approached, the forest composition shifted subtly, with increasing evidence of intentional design partially obscured by natural processes. Then, emerging into a small clearing protected on 3 sides by granite outcroppings, he found himself standing in what was unmistakably a deliberate planting: 7 ancient apple trees, arranged in a specific geometric pattern, clearly visible despite the forest growth that had emerged around them. The trees themselves bore little resemblance to conventional orchard specimens. Their massive trunks and soaring height more closely resembled forest patriarchs than cultivated fruit trees. Decades of unmanaged growth had created gnarly, spreading forms that reached nearly 40 feet into the canopy. Extraordinary dimensions for apple trees, which typically remain much smaller under cultivation. Their bark, deeply furrowed and covered with complex lichen communities, suggested extreme age consistent with Isaiah's timeline. "Incredible," Jack whispered, approaching the nearest specimen with reverence appropriate to its age and significance. Despite their wild appearance, these were unquestionably cultivated varieties rather than chance seedlings. The branch structure, even in its unmanaged state, displayed the distinctive characteristics of intentionally propagated trees. Most convincingly, several specimens showed evidence of ancient grafting unions at their base, the unmistakable swelling that occurs where cultivated varieties are joined to rootstock. Using Isaiah's journal illustrations, Jack began identifying individual specimens corresponding to the 7 named varieties. Frost Guardian, with its distinctive upright growth habit. Summer Keeper, notable for its unusually symmetrical branching. Healer's Sweet, identified by the peculiar smooth patches in its otherwise rugged bark. Crimson Heart, distinguished by the reddish tint visible in new branch growth. Winter Justice, recognizable by its exceptionally thick trunk and wide-spreading form. Orchard's Pride, identified by its unusual branching angle. And finally, the most imposing specimen, Founder's Gift, standing at the center of the arrangement. Most remarkably, despite their age and lack of management, several trees displayed evidence of recent flowering and even developing fruit, an extraordinary demonstration of vitality and disease resistance in trees that had survived without human intervention for potentially 2 centuries. This natural resilience represented precisely the qualities most lacking in modern commercial varieties, dependent on intensive chemical management. Jack carefully documented each specimen with photographs and notes, recording GPS coordinates, measuring trunk diameters, and collecting small bark samples for potential DNA analysis. The scientific value of these trees extended beyond their historical significance. They represented an unprecedented resource for studying long-term adaptation and resilience in cultivated apple varieties surviving without human intervention. As afternoon light began fading toward evening, Jack completed his initial documentation and turned his attention to immediate practical concerns. The mother trees, having survived for generations without management, were not under immediate threat. However, their genetic material, the living embodiment of Isaiah's foresight, required careful preservation. Following protocols established. During his research career, Jack collected dormant buds from each specimen, properly labeled and protected them for transport back to the orchard, where they could be grafted onto existing rootstock. Before departing, Jack sat briefly on a fallen log facing the trees, absorbing the significance of what he'd discovered. These weren't merely historical curiosities, but living connections to an alternative agricultural approach, one based on resilience, diversity, and relationship with specific landscapes rather than standardization and chemical dependence. The genetic material preserved in these ancient specimens might offer crucial resources for developing apple varieties adapted to climate challenges that Isaiah had somehow anticipated nearly 2 centuries earlier. The return journey, despite growing shadows and increasing fatigue, proceeded with efficiency born of purpose and careful navigation. Jack reached his truck as twilight deepened into dusk, the samples and documentation securely stored in his pack. The expedition had succeeded beyond his expectations, locating not just historically interesting specimens, but potentially transformative genetic resources preserved through Isaiah's remarkable foresight. As he drove back toward the orchard, Jack's thoughts alternated between practical next steps and broader implications. The immediate priority would be propagating this genetic material through grafting onto existing rootstock, ensuring its preservation regardless of the mother tree's ultimate fate. Beyond preservation, scientific analysis might reveal specific adaptations with applications for contemporary challenges. Disease resistance genes, cold hardiness mechanisms, or drought-tolerant strategies developed through centuries of natural selection. Most significantly, the mother trees represented living proof of an alternative approach to agricultural knowledge, one developed through careful observation and relationship with specific landscapes rather than laboratory isolation or market considerations. Their discovery offered not just genetic resources, but validation of the integrated, place-based wisdom the Harrington Orchard had maintained against increasing pressure to adopt standardized industrial methods. The morning after his expedition, Jack surveyed the collected samples arrayed on the grafting shed's workbench. 7 labeled containers preserved dormant buds from each mother tree, their genetic material now safely transported from the remote mountain location to the orchard. Despite his exhaustion from the previous day's journey, he had risen before dawn to begin the crucial work of propagating this extraordinary genetic legacy. "You look like you haven't slept," Eleanor observed, bringing a thermos of coffee to the shed where Jack had already prepared rootstock for the first grafting attempts. Her practiced eye noted the meticulous organization of his workstation. Isaiah's journal, open to detailed grafting instructions, the heirloom grafting knife positioned alongside modern tools, and healing wax warming to precisely the right consistency in a small pot. "Too much on my mind," Jack admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "These samples represent something extraordinary, Gran. Not just historically interesting specimens, but potentially revolutionary genetic material. I need to ensure they survive." Jack's scientific training had prepared him for the technical aspects of preserving these samples. During his research career, he had documented rare apple varieties throughout New England, developing specialized techniques for propagating stressed specimens with limited viable material. This expertise now served a more personal purpose as he carefully prepared to graft Isaiah's varieties onto established rootstock. The process required extraordinary precision. Working with the dormant buds he had collected, Jack implemented a modified chip budding technique particularly effective for specimens with limited propagation material. Each cut, made with the ancestral grafting knife, needed to create perfect cambium contact between the mother tree genetics and the receiving rootstock. The work demanded complete concentration, combining technical skill with an almost artistic sensitivity to the materials. By mid-morning, Jack had successfully completed the first round of grafts, 3 buds from each mother tree variety attached to appropriate rootstock and sealed with the protective wax Eleanor had prepared according to a family recipe documented in Isaiah's journals. These initial grafts would be monitored under carefully controlled conditions in the propagation greenhouse, with subsequent attempts planned using his remaining collected material. "I should contact Dr. Abernathy at the university," Jack said, as they carefully transferred the grafted specimens to the greenhouse. "His lab has the equipment necessary for genetic analysis of the bark samples, and we'll need documentation from a recognized pomologist to establish the scientific significance of what we've found." Eleanor nodded agreement. "The sooner the better. Once word gets out about these trees, things will move quickly. We should have expert verification before that happens." Jack's relationship with Dr. William Abernathy dated to his research years at the university. The distinguished professor of agricultural genetics had served as a mentor during Jack's doctoral studies, supporting his unconventional research focus on heritage apple varieties, when most of the department prioritized high-tech breeding approaches. Though sometimes skeptical of traditional methods, Abernathy maintained genuine scientific curiosity about alternative agricultural approaches with demonstrated effectiveness. The call to Abernathy's lab yielded a more immediate response than Jack had anticipated. Rather than scheduling a future appointment, the professor offered to visit the orchard that very afternoon. "If what you're describing is accurate," he said, his typically measured voice betraying unusual excitement, "these specimens could represent an unprecedented resource for understanding long-term adaptation in cultivated Malus varieties. I'll bring portable sampling equipment for preliminary analysis. By early afternoon, Dr. Abernathy's university vehicle crunched up the gravel driveway. At 67, the professor retained the energetic demeanor and precise movements that had characterized his 4 decades in agricultural genetics research. His silver hair and tweed jacket with leather elbow patches embodied the archetypal academic aesthetic, but the specialized equipment he unpacked from his vehicle reflected cutting-edge scientific capability. "Jack, fascinating call this morning." Abernathy greeted him with a vigorous handshake. "Wild apple specimens with 2 centuries of continuous adaptation, and you say they're still producing viable fruit without any management or chemical interventions. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but I'm genuinely intrigued." Jack led him directly to the propagation greenhouse, where the grafted specimens had been carefully arranged and labeled. As they entered, Dr. Abernathy immediately shifted from collegial conversation to focused scientific observation, his trained eye evaluating the grafting technique, specimen quality, and visible characteristics of the collected material. These budwoods show remarkable cellular integrity for specimens collected from trees of such reported age, he noted, examining one sample under a portable microscope he had brought. The vascular structure suggests exceptional vigor despite the apparent age, quite unusual for Malus domestica in unmanaged conditions. Jack presented Isaiah's journal and map, explaining the discovery context, while Dr. Abernathy examined the dormant buds with increasingly evident interest. The professor's initial professional skepticism gradually transformed into scientific excitement as he reviewed the documented evidence and examined the physical specimens. "The bark morphology on these samples is unlike anything I've seen in commercial varieties," he observed, his methodical examination growing more animated. "These cellular structures typically break down in standard cultivars after 40 to 50 years, yet these samples show remarkably intact vascular systems, consistent with extreme age while maintaining active growth patterns. Quite extraordinary." After thorough examination of the grafted specimens, Jack shared the bark samples he had collected for potential DNA analysis. Dr. Abernathy carefully transferred these into sterile containers from his portable lab kit, labeling, each with precise scientific notation. "My lab can perform preliminary genetic sequencing by the end of the week," he explained, his voice taking on the measured tone he used when discussing significant research potential. "We'll be looking for several key indicators, genetic markers for disease resistance, cold hardiness factors, and particularly drought tolerance mechanisms. Given the reported age and isolation of these specimens, they may contain genetic resources lost in contemporary commercial breeding programs." As their technical discussion continued, Eleanor arrived with Dr. Eliza Chen, the state pomologist who had documented unusual disease resistance patterns in the Harrington Orchard during previous visits. A leading expert in apple variety identification and heritage fruit documentation, Dr. Chen had responded to Eleanor's call with immediate interest, rearranging her schedule to evaluate Jack's discovery. When Eleanor mentioned pre-Civil War varieties potentially surviving without human intervention, "I had to see for myself," Dr. Chen explained, her enthusiasm evident despite her typically reserved professional demeanor. "The genetic diversity we've lost in apple cultivation over the past century represents one of the most significant vulnerabilities in our current food system. Rediscovering varieties with natural resilience would be extraordinarily valuable." Jack provided a detailed account of his expedition and discovery while the 2 scientists examined the collected materials. Dr. Chen paid particular attention to Isaiah's journal illustrations of the fruit characteristics for each mother tree variety, her expertise in historical pomology, allowing her to recognize significant patterns in the documented traits. These descriptions align with characteristics we've identified as particularly valuable but increasingly rare in contemporary varieties, she noted, comparing Isaiah's illustrations with reference materials she had brought. Extended natural storage capacity without controlled atmosphere technology, natural resistance to key fungal pathogens, extreme cold hardiness. These are precisely the qualities modern breeding programs have struggled to reintroduce after they were bred out in favor of cosmetic uniformity and shipping durability. By late afternoon, the farmhouse kitchen had transformed into an impromptu scientific conference. The dining table, covered with maps, journals, reference materials, and preliminary sample analyses, served as the central workspace for increasingly animated discussions of the discovery's significance. What had begun as a cautious scientific evaluation had evolved into genuine excitement as both experts recognized the potential importance of the mother trees. Based on these preliminary examinations, these specimens appear to represent an exceptional find, Dr. Abernathy confirmed, his academic caution now balanced with evident enthusiasm. If the genetic analysis confirms what these physical characteristics suggest, these varieties could contain adaptations that would be extraordinarily valuable for developing climate-resilient apple cultivars. Dr. Chen nodded agreement, her specialist perspective adding additional dimension to the evaluation. From a pomological standpoint, these appear to be distinctive varieties not represented in any current germplasm collections. The described flavor profiles and usage characteristics would place them in the highest category of heritage apple significance, particularly if they maintain these qualities after propagation. The scientific validation brought new dimensions to Jack's understanding of his discovery. What had begun as a personally meaningful historical connection had expanded into something with potentially broader significance for contemporary agriculture. The mother trees represented not just family heritage, but genetic resources, with applications for addressing pressing challenges facing apple cultivation worldwide. What makes this discovery particularly significant, Dr. Chen explained, is that these trees have apparently adapted to changing conditions for nearly 2 centuries without human intervention or chemical supports. This represents a natural selection process for resilience that we cannot replicate in laboratory breeding programs or controlled field trials. If these varieties maintain their described characteristics after propagation, they could provide genetic resources of extraordinary value. As evening approached, the discussion shifted toward practical next steps for documenting and preserving Isaiah's varieties. Dr. Abernathy outlined protocols for comprehensive genetic analysis, while Dr. Chen described the process for officially registering the rediscovered varieties with international pomological organizations. Both experts emphasized the importance of thorough documentation before any public announcements about the discovery. I suggest we establish a formal research partnership, Dr. Abernathy proposed, his academic mind already organizing the necessary scientific protocols. My lab can handle the genetic analysis and documentation, while Dr. Chen's expertise in historical varieties can provide essential context for interpreting the results. With your permission, Jack, we could develop a comprehensive research program to evaluate these varieties' potential applications. Jack appreciated the scientific rigor his colleagues brought to evaluating the mother trees, but he also recognized the limitations of conventional research approaches in capturing the integrated knowledge system Isaiah had documented. The varieties weren't simply collections of desirable genetic traits, but components of a holistic agricultural approach developed through generations of relationship with specific landscapes. I welcome the research partnership, Jack responded. Carefully, but I'd like to ensure we document not just the genetic characteristics, but the broader context Isaiah described in his journals. These varieties were part of an integrated approach to orchard management, one based on relationships between species rather than isolated traits. Both scientists nodded understanding, though their institutional perspectives naturally emphasized quantifiable characteristics over integrated systems. They recognized the value of Isaiah's holistic documentation while focusing on elements that aligned with contemporary scientific frameworks. As the meeting concluded with plans for formal research protocols, Jack walked his colleagues to their vehicles. The evening light cast long shadows across the orchard, illuminating the heritage trees that had been maintained through generations of Harrington stewardship. The contrast between these complex, integrated plantings and standard commercial orchards seemed particularly striking in this moment of scientific validation. "You've maintained something remarkable here," Dr. Chen noted, pausing to observe the orchard's distinctive patterns. Most agricultural traditions with this level of sophistication have been lost to industrial methods. Finding living evidence of a system developed through such careful observation provides valuable perspective on alternatives to our current approaches. After his colleagues departed with samples, documentation agreements, and plans for further analysis, Jack returned to the propagation greenhouse to check on the grafted specimens. The buds from the mother trees, now carefully attached to established rootstock, represented both historical connection and future possibility, a living bridge between Isaiah's 19th century foresight and contemporary agricultural challenges. The scientific validation had confirmed what Jack had sensed during his discovery in the mountain valley. The mother trees represented far more than interesting historical specimens. They embodied an alternative approach to agricultural knowledge that offered potential solutions to contemporary challenges. Isaiah's varieties, preserved through his remarkable foresight, might now contribute to addressing vulnerabilities in modern apple cultivation that he had somehow anticipated nearly 2 centuries earlier. Eleanor joined him in the greenhouse, her practical wisdom providing essential balance to the academic perspectives that had dominated the afternoon's discussions. "Scientific validation is important," she observed, examining the grafted specimens with experienced eyes. "But remembering why Isaiah preserved these trees matters too. He wasn't just saving interesting varieties, he was maintaining a relationship with the land that recognized its wisdom." Jack nodded agreement, understanding that the true significance of their discovery extended beyond genetic resources to include the knowledge system that had created and preserved them. The scientific validation provided important confirmation of the mother tree's value within contemporary frameworks, but the integrated wisdom documented in Isaiah's journals represented something equally valuable that conventional research approaches might overlook. The call came at 6:47 the following morning, pulling Jack from deep sleep after his first restful night since the discovery. Dr. Abernathy's voice held an unusual tension that immediately dispelled any lingering drowsiness. "Jack, we may have a situation. Someone at the lab leaked information about your samples. I've already received calls from 2 agricultural corporations asking about the Harrington specimens and pre-industrial apple genetics. I've shared nothing beyond confirming we're analyzing historical apple varieties, but you should prepare for visitors." Jack thanked him for the warning, his mind racing through implications as he quickly dressed. The scientific validation had barely begun, yet word had already spread beyond their small circle of researchers. The timing couldn't have been worse. The grafted specimens were still in their most vulnerable early stage, and he had neither completed documentation of the mother trees nor developed a clear strategy for protecting their genetic legacy. By the time he reached the kitchen, Eleanor was already preparing breakfast with the heightened efficiency she displayed during critical orchard events, like impending frosts or harvest emergencies. "Dr. Abernathy called the landline before trying your cell," she explained, setting a plate of eggs and toast before him. I've already contacted Maria at the Land Trust about expediting the conservation easement paperwork. If corporations are sniffing around, we need legal protections in place immediately. Jack nodded gratitude for her foresight. They had been discussing a conservation easement for years, a legal arrangement that would permanently protect the orchard from development, while maintaining family ownership. The discovery of the mother trees made this protection more urgent, potentially extending it to include the remote national forest location where the original trees grew. They had barely finished breakfast when the distinctive crunch of tires on gravel announced the first arrival. Through the window, Jack observed a sleek black SUV with rental plates pulling into the driveway, the same vehicle model Orchard Tech representatives typically drove during their acquisition visits. His suspicions were confirmed when Bradley Reynolds, the company's senior acquisition specialist, emerged in his characteristic business casual attire that managed to look simultaneously relaxed and expensive. They didn't waste any time, Eleanor observed dryly. "Shall I prepare the special cider we save for unwelcome corporate visitors?" Jack smiled, despite the tension. The special cider was their code for the most tannic, astringent heritage variety they produced, one that invariably made corporate representatives pucker in poorly concealed discomfort while pretending to enjoy the authentic experience. "Maybe later. Let's hear what they're offering first. The mother trees have changed our position considerably." Reynolds approached with the practiced warmth and calculated familiarity he had developed over months of previous visits. "Jack! Beautiful! Morning on the farm. I was in the area for meetings and thought I'd stop by to follow up on our conversation from earlier this week. I've got some updated figures I think you'll find compelling. Jack invited him into the kitchen rather than the formal sitting room, a deliberate choice that placed their conversation in the practical heart of the farmhouse rather than a space designed for business negotiations. Eleanor busied herself with bread dough while remaining within earshot, her presence a reminder of the multi-generational commitment the farm represented. Reynolds wasted little time pivoting from pleasantries to business. "Our company has become aware of some interesting historical varieties you've recently documented. These heritage specimens potentially align perfectly with Orchard Tech's new Resilient Futures breeding program. We'd like to discuss a potential research partnership that would be substantially more generous than our previous acquisition offers." The rapid shift in terminology from acquisition to research partnership wasn't lost on Jack. The discovery had clearly transformed their perception of the orchard from valuable real estate to potential genetic resource. Reynolds proceeded to outline a proposal involving exclusive licensing of the mother tree genetics, guaranteed research funding, and a significant upfront payment that would resolve all the orchard's financial challenges. "We're prepared to offer $3.2 million for exclusive rights to these genetics, plus ongoing royalties from any commercial varieties developed using this germplasm," Reynolds concluded, sliding a glossy presentation folder across the table. "Your family would maintain ownership of the physical property, with Orchard Tech gaining exclusive research and development rights to the genetic material. We'd even establish a Harrington Heritage Research Station on a portion of the property to honor your family's contribution." The offer represented precisely the type of extraction Jack had anticipated, separating the genetic resources from the integrated knowledge system that had created and preserved them. Orchard Tech sought to acquire isolated traits they could incorporate into their industrial production model without addressing the fundamental vulnerabilities of that approach. "That's a substantial offer," Jack acknowledged carefully. "However, we're still in the early stages of documenting these varieties and understanding their characteristics. Any decisions about their future would be premature at this point." Reynolds leaned forward with practiced earnestness. "Jack, I understand your caution, but timing is critical here. Heritage genetics like these represent significant potential value, but only if properly developed and protected. Without adequate resources for research and legal protection, these discoveries remain vulnerable. Our company can provide both. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle, this one bearing the logo of VitaTech Agricultural Systems, Orchard Tech's primary competitor in the agricultural biotechnology sector. The corporate representative who emerged, Dr. Sofia Martinez, had visited previously to discuss their sustainable intensification programs, though she had shown little interest in the orchard's heritage approach during those conversations. "Appears I'm not the only one who's heard rumors," Reynolds observed with forced lightness that failed to mask his competitive concern. "The agricultural grapevine works quickly these days." Dr. Martinez's approach differed significantly from Reynolds' calculated familiarity. With a PhD in agricultural biotechnology and experience in both academic and corporate research, she positioned herself as a scientific colleague rather than a business representative. "Mr. Harrington, I apologize for arriving unannounced," she began after introductions. "But our research division is extremely interested in discussing potential collaboration regarding the heritage apple varieties recently discovered on your property. Unlike some companies," she added with a pointed glance toward Reynolds, "VitaTech is committed to open-source research models that preserve farmer autonomy while developing climate-resilient varieties. The contrast in approaches reflected fundamental differences in corporate strategies. Orchard Tech pursued proprietary genetics, protected by aggressive patent enforcement, while VitaTech emphasized technology-intensive growing systems that created dependency through specialized equipment and technical protocols. Both ultimately sought to extract valuable elements from traditional agricultural approaches while maintaining control within industrial frameworks. Jack listened to Dr. Martinez's proposal with the same careful attention he had given Reynolds, noting how each corporation framed their interest in terms that superficially aligned with values they presumed he held. Orchard Tech emphasized preservation of family legacy and financial security, while VitaTech focused on scientific collaboration and climate resilience. Neither acknowledged the fundamental contradiction between their industrial agricultural models and the integrated, relationship-based approach that had created and preserved the mother trees. By mid-morning, the farmhouse driveway resembled an impromptu corporate convention. Representatives from Global Seed Ventures, Agri-Innovation Partners, and Heritage Genetics Corporation had joined the initial visitors, each arriving with carefully crafted proposals for partnerships that primarily served their respective business models. Jack maintained polite but non-committal responses to all, recognizing that hasty decisions under pressure would likely compromise the integrity of what Isaiah had worked to preserve. Most revealing was how each corporate representative framed the problem Jack supposedly faced. Reynolds emphasized the financial challenges of maintaining a small orchard operation in a consolidated market. Dr. Martinez focused on the scientific resources required to properly document heritage genetics. The Global Seed Ventures representative stressed legal vulnerabilities without patent protection, while Agri-Innovation Partners highlighted marketing limitations that prevented heritage varieties from reaching broader markets. Each framing conveniently positioned their corporation as the necessary solution to these constructed problems. None acknowledged the most fundamental reality, that the Harrington Orchard had successfully preserved extraordinary agricultural wisdom across 5 generations, specifically by remaining independent from industrial models that would have dismantled its integrated approach. The corporate convergence reached new levels when a helicopter bearing the distinctive logo of Transcontinental Agricultural Holdings circled overhead before landing in an adjacent field. The company's arrival via aircraft, rather than driving the perfectly accessible roads, demonstrated both their substantial resources and their perception of urgency in securing access to the mother tree genetics before competitors. "We've officially become a corporate feeding frenzy," Eleanor observed dryly as they watched the helicopters approach from the kitchen window. Thomas would find this both amusing and horrifying. The continuous arrival of agricultural corporations created an unintended consequence that Jack recognized might ultimately prove advantageous. Their competing interests prevented any single entity from establishing exclusive access. As representatives gathered in the farmhouse kitchen with overlapping proposals, their competitive tension became increasingly evident, transforming what might have been coordinated pressure into divided efforts that gave Jack greater space for independent consideration. By early afternoon, the corporate representatives had established informal camps around the property. Orchard Tech and Vitatech occupied opposite ends of the front porch, their teams occasionally exchanging thinly veiled competitive remarks. Global Seed Ventures had set up an impromptu presentation area near the barn, complete with digital displays, showing potential global distribution networks for heritage genetics. The Transcontinental Agricultural Holdings team had returned to their helicopter to retrieve additional materials, including elaborately produced videos demonstrating their genetic preservation initiatives. "I've counted 17 corporate representatives so far," Eleanor reported, after returning from feeding the heritage breed chickens that provided supplemental income through premium egg sales. "They're beginning to interfere with actual farm operations." The Agri-Innovation team wanted to set up their presentation right in front of the Propagation greenhouse. Jack sighed, recognizing that the situation had become both disruptive and potentially risky for the vulnerable grafted specimens. "We need to establish some boundaries. I appreciate their interest, but the orchard requires our attention, particularly with the new grafts at such a critical stage." With Eleanor's assistance, Jack gathered the various corporate representatives and delivered a clear message. While he appreciated their interest, immediate decisions about the mother tree genetics were premature. He would consider all proposals, but required time to properly evaluate options without the pressure of on-site corporate presence. He established a formal process for submission of written proposals and requested that all representatives vacate the property to allow essential orchard operations to continue. Most departed reluctantly, each attempting final persuasive efforts, emphasizing the particular advantages of their approach. The Orchard Tech team was last to leave, with Reynolds making a final appeal that revealed the competitive dynamics at play. "Jack, consider carefully who you partner with on this. Some of these companies will exploit these genetics while providing minimal compensation to your family. Orchard Tech is prepared to increase our offer to $4.5 million for exclusive rights, a fair reflection of the potential value these varieties represent." After the last vehicle departed, Jack and Eleanor surveyed the quiet orchard with shared relief. The corporate invasion had been intense but illuminating, revealing both the perceived value of their discovery and the fundamentally extractive nature of the interest it had generated. Each corporation sought to separate valuable genetic resources from the integrated system that had created and preserved them, isolating profitable elements while discarding the holistic approach that made them effective. "They all missed the essential point," Jack observed, as they walked together through the heritage section, featuring apple varieties dating to the orchard's founding. Isaiah didn't just collect interesting varieties. He developed an integrated system where genetic diversity was one element among many. Extracting these genetics from that system fundamentally misunderstands what makes them valuable. Eleanor nodded agreement. "They see parts where Isaiah saw relationships. That's been the core difference all along. As sunset approached, Jack's phone continued receiving messages with increased offers and expanded partnership proposals from the various corporations. The discovery's value within conventional economic frameworks had clearly escalated through competitive dynamics, with corporations perceiving both potential profit and risk in allowing competitors to control these genetics. What none of their proposals addressed, however, was the underlying reality that had motivated Isaiah's creation of the Mother Tree Sanctuary. The vulnerability of agricultural systems that sacrifice resilience for standardization and relationship for control. The corporations sought to extract genetic resources that might address symptoms of this vulnerability, without acknowledging the fundamental flaws in the industrial approaches they maintained. 3 weeks after discovering the mother trees, Jack sat at the worn kitchen table, where generations of Harringtons had made decisions that shaped the orchard's future. Before him lay an array of documents representing dramatically different possibilities for the mother tree's legacy. Corporate contracts offering unprecedented financial compensation, university research partnership proposals, conservation easement, paperwork, and most significantly, Isaiah's journal, open to a passage that seemed to speak directly across the centuries to this precise moment of decision. As these varieties pass to future generations, Isaiah had written in 1846, remember that their value lies not merely in their physical traits, but in the relationships they embody. Separated from these relationships and reduced to isolated characteristics, they lose the very resilience I have worked to preserve. I entrust these trees not to those who would extract their qualities, but to those who would maintain the approach that created them. The timing seemed almost uncanny, as if Isaiah had anticipated not just the agricultural challenges of the 21st century, but the specific pressures his descendants would face when rediscovering his work. This passage, written as guidance for future Harringtons, offered a philosophical framework for decisions that modern economic systems hadn't been designed to value. The grafted specimens from the mother trees had exceeded expectations, showing remarkable vigor and successful bud development despite their transition from wild mountain conditions to carefully managed propagation. In the greenhouse, the 7 varieties displayed distinctive growth patterns that reflected their diverse genetics. Frost Guardian, developing the earliest leaf emergence. Winter Justice, showing the most robust structural development. Healers. Sweet, already displaying the distinctive bark characteristics described in Isaiah's notes. Dr. Abernathy's preliminary genetic analysis had confirmed what visual examination suggested. These varieties contained unique characteristics absent from modern commercial cultivars. Most significantly, they showed genetic markers associated with natural disease resistance, extreme cold hardiness, and drought tolerance, combined in patterns not found in contemporary breeding lines. The analysis had identified several previously undocumented genetic sequences that appeared to correlate with the exceptional resilience Isaiah had documented. The scientific validation had intensified corporate interest considerably. Orchard Tech had increased their offer to $5.7 million for exclusive rights to the genetics, with additional royalty structures that could potentially generate substantial ongoing revenue. VitaTech had proposed a more complex arrangement involving research partnerships, technology transfers, and premium pricing for varieties developed from the mother tree genetics. 3 additional agricultural corporations had submitted competitive proposals with various combinations of upfront payment, research funding, and commercialization arrangements. These offers would resolve all financial pressures facing the Harrington Orchard, with substantial resources remaining for expanding operations, implementing infrastructure improvements, or even establishing a foundation dedicated to heritage apple preservation. From a purely economic perspective, accepting one of these proposals represented the obvious choice, leveraging a remarkable historical discovery to secure the orchard's financial future while allowing corporate resources to develop and distribute beneficial varieties to a global market. Yet each corporate proposal contained fundamental assumptions that conflicted with Isaiah's documented intentions and the integrated approach the Harrington Orchard had maintained through generations. All sought to separate valuable genetics from the holistic system that had created them, extracting profitable traits while discarding the relationship-based approach that had preserved these varieties through centuries of agricultural industrialization. The FIR, University Research Partnerships, offered an alternative that better aligned with values of open knowledge and scientific advancement. Dr. Abernathy had secured preliminary approval for a major research initiative that would document, preserve, and study the mother tree genetics within academic frameworks. This approach would generate valuable scientific knowledge and potentially create educational opportunities for future orchardists while maintaining the genetics within public domain rather than proprietary corporate control. However, even these well-intentioned scientific proposals contained subtle biases toward reduction and fragmentation, studying isolated genetic traits, disease resistance mechanisms, or cold hardiness factors without necessarily preserving the integrated system. Isaiah had documented conventional research methodologies, with their emphasis on controlled variables and quantifiable outcomes, struggled to capture the relational knowledge embedded in the Harrington approach. The conservation easement represented the most defensive option, legally protecting both the orchard and potentially the mother tree sanctuary from development or resource extraction in perpetuity. This approach would preserve the physical trees and landscape relationships, but might not address the broader potential of Isaiah's varieties to contribute to agricultural resilience beyond the Harrington property boundaries. As Jack considered these options, he found himself returning repeatedly to a fundamental question. What would best honor Isaiah's intentions while addressing contemporary agricultural challenges? His ancestor hadn't created the Mother Tree Sanctuary as a personal project or profit-seeking venture, but as a deliberate effort to preserve agricultural wisdom he recognized was being lost to industrial approaches. His journals revealed sophisticated understanding of how standardization and chemical dependency were creating vulnerabilities that would eventually threaten food systems. Vulnerabilities now manifesting in exactly the ways he had anticipated. "You've been staring at those papers for hours," Eleanor observed, joining him at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of fresh cider pressed from last season's stored apples. "Sometimes I think we overthink these decisions. What does your gut tell you?" Jack smiled gratefully, appreciating both the cider and her practical wisdom. "My gut says Isaiah didn't preserve these varieties for corporate patents or academic papers. He created a living agricultural system meant to evolve through continued relationship with specific landscapes. Breaking up that system misses the entire point, even if it's financially beneficial or scientifically interesting." Eleanor nodded, her expression suggesting she had anticipated this response. "So, what's the alternative that maintains the system while sharing its benefits?" The question crystallized something Jack had been considering since first discovering the mother trees, an approach that didn't fit neatly into conventional economic or scientific categories, but might better preserve the integrated wisdom Isaiah had documented while allowing its benefits to spread beyond the Harrington property. "What if we created a different model entirely?" he suggested, the concept taking clearer form as he articulated it. "Not corporate licensing or traditional academic research, but a collaborative network of small orchards committed to maintaining these varieties within integrated systems similar to what Isaiah documented." The idea gained momentum as he developed it further. Rather than fragmenting the mother tree genetics into isolated traits for industrial application, they could establish a network of independent orchardists committed to growing these varieties, using ecological approaches aligned with Isaiah's documented methods. Participating orchards would receive grafting wood with agreements to maintain specific management practices, document outcomes in different bioregions, and freely share knowledge developed through this distributed approach. Instead of centralizing control of these genetics, we distribute them through a network of practitioners committed to relationship-based approaches, Jack explained, his excitement growing as the concept aligned increasingly with Isaiah's documented intentions. The mother tree genetics would remain in active cultivation within diverse landscapes, continuing to adapt through relationship with specific places, rather than being frozen in seed banks or reduced to isolated traits in breeding programs. Eleanor considered the proposal thoughtfully. It's not the most financially lucrative approach, but it maintains the integrity of Isaiah's system while allowing its benefits to spread. The question is whether we can develop sufficient structure to protect against the inevitable corporate attempts to acquire and monopolize these genetics once they're distributed. This represented the most significant challenge to Jack's emerging vision. Without the legal protections of patents or the institutional structure of academic research, how could they prevent corporate interests from acquiring these varieties once they entered broader cultivation? The history of agriculture contained numerous examples of traditional varieties being appropriated, slightly modified, and then patented by commercial interests, restricting access to genetic resources that had been developed through generations of open community practice. As Jack wrestled with this challenge, he remembered a conversation with Dr. Chen about international seed-sharing networks that had developed innovative approaches to protecting traditional varieties from corporate appropriation. Some used legal frameworks like open-source licensing adapted from software development, while others established protected commons that restricted commercial use while encouraging adaptation and sharing within specific ethical frameworks. The concept of a protected agricultural commons resonated with Isaiah's documented intentions. Rather than relying on restrictive patents or institutional gatekeeping, this approach used community agreements and transparent documentation to maintain open access for practitioners while preventing corporate enclosure of collectively developed resources. With renewed focus, Jack began sketching the framework for what he tentatively called the Harrington Heritage Network, a collaborative approach to preserving and developing the mother tree genetics through relationship-based cultivation across diverse landscapes. Participating orchards would receive propagation material with agreements to maintain these varieties using ecological methods documented in network protocols, preserve complete provenance documentation, acknowledging Isaiah Harrington's original work, freely share knowledge, adaptations and propagation material within the network, never patent or restrict access to these varieties or their derivatives, contribute to collective documentation of how these varieties perform in different bioregions. This approach directly addressed Isaiah's concern that these varieties would lose their essential resilience if separated from the relationship-based system that created them. Rather than extracting isolated genetic traits, the network would maintain and develop the integrated approach while allowing its benefits to spread beyond the boundaries of a single property. As evening deepened into night, Jack continued developing this alternative vision, drawing unexpected connections between Isaiah's 19th century wisdom and emerging 21st century concepts of open-source genetics, protected commons, and distributed knowledge networks. The approach wouldn't generate the immediate financial returns that corporate offers promised, but it aligned more authentically with the multi-generational values the Harrington Orchard had maintained through decades of agricultural industrialization. By morning, Jack had drafted a comprehensive framework that integrated elements from various alternatives into a distinctive approach honoring Isaiah's documented intentions while addressing contemporary realities. The Harrington Heritage Network would maintain the mother tree genetics as a protected commons, accessible to participating orchards, committed to ecological cultivation while legally structured to prevent corporate appropriation through a combination of open-source licensing, transparent documentation, and community agreements. This approach required sacrificing significant financial gain from exclusive corporate licensing, but it preserved something Jack had come to recognize as equally valuable: the integrity of an agricultural knowledge system developed through generations of careful observation and relationship with specific landscapes. The mother trees would remain living connections to this alternative approach, continuing to evolve through active cultivation rather than becoming isolated specimens in gene banks or fragmented traits in breeding programs. 1 year after discovering Isaiah's map, Jack stood in the heritage section of the Harrington Orchard, surrounded by thriving young trees, successful grafts from each mother tree variety now established in carefully designed polyculture systems. Despite their youth, these specimens already displayed remarkable resilience, with natural resistance to diseases that had affected conventional varieties throughout the region. The Harrington Heritage Network had become a reality, with 37 participating orchards across New England. Each member received grafting wood, with agreements to maintain ecological growing practices, document outcomes, and freely share knowledge. The legal structure Jack had established created a protected commons that maintained these varieties as shared resources while preventing corporate appropriation, distinguishing between commercial exploitation and relationship-based cultivation. "Your great-great-grandfather would be proud," Eleanor observed, joining Jack among the young trees. "He preserved these varieties not for profit, but for future generations facing challenges he somehow anticipated." The orchard itself had transformed from a financially struggling operation to a thriving center for heritage apple cultivation and education. The propagation greenhouse produced hundreds of mother tree grafts annually, while the renovated barn hosted workshops where traditional growing methods were shared with an expanding community of practitioners. Most significant was how the mother tree genetics remained embedded within integrated systems rather than extracted as isolated traits. Unlike conventional research that separated valuable characteristics from their ecological context, the network maintained the holistic approach Isaiah had documented, allowing these varieties to continue adapting through relationship with specific landscapes rather than becoming standardized products. Financial sustainability came through diverse revenue streams, educational programs, modest member contributions, targeted grants, and collaborative research, providing sufficient resources while maintaining independence from any single funding source. A conservation easement permanently protected both the orchard and the mother tree sanctuary, ensuring the integrated system would continue regardless of future economic pressures. These trees aren't just historically interesting specimens, Jack explained to a group of agricultural students gathered for a workshop. They represent a different approach to agricultural knowledge, one based on relationship rather than control. Their adaptation over centuries demonstrates resilience that laboratory breeding programs struggle to replicate precisely because those programs isolate traits from the systems that develop them. As sunset cast long shadows across the orchard, Jack reflected on Isaiah's remarkable foresight. The map hadn't merely led to valuable apple varieties, but to rediscovery of an alternative agricultural approach increasingly relevant in an era of climate disruption and ecological decline. The mother tree's legacy continued, not as corporate products or academic specimens, but as living connections to a wisdom tradition that recognized relationship as the foundation of true agricultural resilience. What Isaiah had preserved in that remote mountain sanctuary wasn't just apple genetics, but a fundamentally different way of knowing, one that future generations would need even more than he could have imagined when drawing his meticulous map nearly 2 centuries ago.